Okay, we are live. Hi, this is William Ramsey. Welcome to William Ramsey Investigates. On today's show, I have a very special guest, returning guest. His name is J.P. Holding. We spoke a while back about another of his books. Title of that talk was Defending the Resurrection. Did Jesus Rise from the Dead? But today, we're going to talk about a book he published in 2014. Title is Jesus Was a Mushroom and Other Lies You Won't Believe. And really interesting. I know a lot of people who've gone into John Allegro's work very seriously, even though it's been refuted or other scholars have debunked it. But I think it's something in the modern worldview these days is a lot of conspiratorial thinking. Myself as well. I mean, I've done a lot. I think there's a lot of conspiracies out there. West Memphis 3 is definitely a conspiracy. But JP and I probably different on 9/11, but we can talk about that too. But there's also a lot of different interpretations, misinterpretations, and ideas that get cemented to some concepts and just get bandied about the internet all over. So, we can go into that in greater detail. But I have a list of other JP Holding. He's done 20 books and on a variety of titles, and some of the titles, other titles are Best Evidence for Jesus, Blood Moon Lunacy, Christian Answers to This Generation's Questions. There are a lot of questions, Scripture and Slavery, and What in Hell is Going On. And so he's written over 20 total books, and his website where you can see a lot of those is called Tecton Apologetics Ministries. It's www.tektonics.org, and I'll put that in the show notes. But again, we're going to talk about this interesting book titled Jesus Was a Mushroom and Other Lies You Won't Believe. So JP Holding, welcome back to the show.
Thanks, William. Glad to be back again.
Awesome. So for people who may not have heard our earlier conversation, can you kind of talk about your background and what led you to write Jesus Was a Mushroom?
Okay, let's start with some background. So I entered into apologetics relatively early age, back in the early 90s, and then I discovered the internet later than most people, sometime in the mid-90s. I joined up with a gentleman who owned a website called the Christian Apologetics Bookshelf in 1996. I contributed a few articles. In 1998, he decided that he wanted to spend more time with his family, so he gave the website to me, and I had to learn hypertext machine language by the seat of my pants and create a whole new website. And that was tectonics.org, the website you mentioned. So from there, I've been progressing into more different ideas to investigate, along with the traditional topics such as the resurrection and the reliability of the New Testament. I became interested in other side issues. And in about 2012 or so, I had a reader of my website who asked me to look into a Christian production called The Fuel Project, which involved a lot of belief in conspiracy theories, including many of those that are featured in this book. That's the topic today. At the time, I wrote a book responding directly to the Fuel Project series, and then I decided to take some of that and mix it together with some other material I'd had on other conspiracy theories that weren't mentioned by the Fuel Project, and I put them all together into this book. And the title, Jesus Was a Mushroom and Other Lies You Won't Believe, as you mentioned, it was related to John Allegro. And that's like one of the older conspiracy theory ideas that's out there and was very easily refuted. Allegro was sort of a crazy scholar who thought the Dead Sea Scrolls had some secret messages in them and that kind of thing, that Jesus was actually a code name for a mushroom that the disciples ingested to have hallucinations. That was such a bad idea that more than a dozen scholars took out an ad in a newspaper telling everyone how crazy they thought that was. So that one was pretty easily taken care of.
Right, and you mentioned Zeitgeist too, which really was very popular. That was a huge internet kind of viral sensation as well.
Right. Yes, it was. And there's a long-standing joke with that. My ministry partner, Nick Peters, likes to ask me again and again, are you going to refute the Zeitgeist movie? And the reason he does that is because initially Zeitgeist was full of things related to Christianity that I had already refuted multiple times, and I was sick of dealing with them. And I kept saying, no, I'm not going to address it. I'm not going to address it. And finally, the Christian Research Journal, the magazine of Hank Hanegraaff's Christian Research Institute, asked me to go ahead and do a review of it. And so that compelled me to go ahead and view the movie. And it was, as I thought, nothing but nonsense. So even though the joke's out of date, though, Nick will still occasionally ask me if I'm going to review the Zeitgeist movie.
But it's still around. I mean, those ideas that Christ was a representation of these other old ancient gods and deities is still popularly, spread about. So, I mean,
It is.
Zeitgeist didn't get it from, it didn't come out of the ether. It's always been around, that whole argument.
Yeah, that's been around since 1800s, 1700s, depending on who you look at.
Right. And I mean, you go into really early stuff, Hislop, how some of these ideas really do get integrated into the culture. And the two Babylons is one example, right?
Yes, it is. It is indeed one example. It's probably their premier example among Christian believers. And after reading that, I was shocked to find out that it's even endorsed by some major names such as John MacArthur.
Oh wow, I didn't know that.
Yes.
And he went into all these old names and really focused on Nimrod, who really is a side figure in the Bible, and really overemphasized him. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I would agree. And what's interesting as well here, another source that was really deeply into this, major Christian source that's into us, is Chick Tracts, Jack Chick Productions. And for a long time, I read the Chick Tracts just for study purposes. And I saw this stuff about Nimrod and showed a picture of him with a horn on his head. And I'm wondering, where in the world do they get all this? And I didn't learn until much later that the source of this was Alexander Hislop. He was the one who was ultimately Jack Chick's source for this material.
Right. And so what was his general thesis? What was Alexander Hislop's thesis?
Well, ultimately, he was his ultimate purpose was to come out with something that he thought would explain the world order as connected to the Catholic Church. He was very much against Catholicism. Now, I'm not particular about Catholicism one way or the other, and I haven't studied it in any depth. But I always tell people, if we're going to address Catholic claims and Catholic history, let's do it in an intelligent way, and not rely on nonsense of the sort that Hislop produces. But what he was looking for, Hislop, was some way to explain the origins of the Catholic Church, as well as other ideas that he had in mind. And so he came up with this whole superstructure that was based on Nimrod, and the idea that he was the head of this world-type religion or system that would form the foundation for occultism and for pagan religion throughout history and throughout various cultures. It gets to the point where he saw Nimrod's influence even in places like Polynesian legend.
Oh wow!
Indirectly,
Yes.
I mean, not directly, obviously, but through time and through derivation.
Right. So he's like, and the whole Nephilim gets brought into the whole mix, which is very, very current kind of trend. A lot of Nephilim type talk, which I've had other guests on and pretty much debunked any post-flood Nephilim stories. I don't know. They had to have got like swam on the outside of Noah's Ark or something like that to survive.
Sure.
People have and I think that's very similar. Like they have very strained factual bases and logic with some of the things that they want to believe or apply biblical to the Bible. I think. Would you agree with a lot of these type of things?
Yeah, that's the sort of thinking that I see constantly in all people who follow conspiracy theories. And I think a quote, I won't read the entirety of it, that I have from that I did for my article in Christian Research Journal. It said it was about Zeitgeist, saying it's not so much that Zeitgeist claims of fact are difficult to refute, but it is difficult to convince the Zeitgeist believer that a refutation is actually taking place. Because a mindset comes up that, well, if someone has an answer to it, there's obviously a conspiracy behind that too. There must be a lie. They must be lying. They must have fabricated evidence to produce this answer. The academia is lying to us. History books are lying to us. Everyone's lying to us. So,
no, it's amazing. I've had that same thing. I've talked to two flat earthers, and they think that anything that I showed to refute that or an additional fact was exactly in that context. It was created to undermine their truth of the earth is flat. I mean, so it's kind of like cult thinking. It's I think it's very important for people to key into that type of thinking too, because I mean, some people may not even be fully, myself included, fully conscious of like trying to get a very objective view. It seems like so. I mean, this book is very current because it there's all that going on in the internet culture, the conspiratorial thinking. People have called me a conspiracy person, a conspiracy. I get labeled with that, even though I'm willing to look at other alternate ideas. But that's a whole, probably another whole issue. I mean, but there's a lot of very curious thinking going on in the world, and I think that this book has a lot of that stuff in here. But sorry, what are your thoughts on that? I mean, in your refutation, if you have a logical, fact-based refutation of a lot of these ideas, how can you get through to people who won't believe that you actually have these statements based in fact?
I've long ago realized that you can't get through to such people because they will constantly shift the goalpost around, and so that you're punting. By the time you've kicked the ball, it's heading through the goalpost. They've already pushed them to the other side of the field so that you didn't score. So, in my mind, most of what I've written this book and other items like it for is for the person who sees this for the first time and says, "Wow, is there an answer for this?" Something that strikes them as odd, and they say, "Well, you know what? This seems like it might have some basis. What's the reality?" And so it's for the people, and this is really, I think, as well for apologetics in general, especially now with the internet making it possible to spread nonsense around so quickly and to enable the people who want to believe it. Uh, Mostly, when I write things like this, it's for that remnant, as you may say, that is actually looking for an honest answer and hasn't already affixed themselves psychologically to the conspiracy idea or whatever other idea it is that they're affixed to.
Right. And I mean, I think there's a lot of that going around. And you talk about the black cube, the all-seeing eye, and you're thinking, because there's a whole, like, almost religious people have become famous for their black cube and Saturn analysis and stuff like that. Can you kind of talk about that?
Oh yeah, well, I really like that one. The first time I saw that, my first thought that came to mind was the Borg from Star Trek. I'm wondering if these people are afraid of the Borg or something when they see these cubes. In general, what this is this idea that anytime you see a black cube, it's some sort of symbol of the worship of Saturn. And as I said initially, you'd think if this was true, it would show up in some kind of reference manual on Greek or Roman religion. But I couldn't find any original source from the ancient world that said black cubes were an object of worship. I couldn't find any modern scholarly source that said that black cubes were an object of worship. And even those who claimed that it was never produced a single quote from any ancient source or any modern scholarly source or from anywhere stating that these black cubes were actually a way to fool you into worshiping pagans. And then there's this idea that all these very black cubes around the world in different contexts are in some way a tribute to Saturn as pagan religion. And these cubes are just were. I don't know how many of these are still around in 2022, 8 years later. They just find them any place and decide that it's some sort of altar for Saturn, just put in the middle of nowhere.
Right. But I mean, they apply the black cube of Saturn to Islam. So
Yes.
that black cube you see at the center above the Kaaba is evidence that there's some occult nature. So that's actually a very common theme through your book, is that the Catholic stuff has an occult nature. The Israeli Supreme Court has an occulted. So the interpretation of these symbols, there's a lot of false interpretations, right?
Yeah, false imputation of meaning would be a precise way to put it. Yeah. It's deciding that no matter what the actual purpose of the object is, and we'll use the black cubes as an example because many of these, besides the one you mentioned for Islam, are so mundane. It's decided that anytime anyone has erected a black cube anywhere, it was for the purpose of worshiping Saturn. And just to use a couple of the examples that came up and what I found out about them. There was one in particular that was in Santa Ana, California, that was part of a science center there. And in looking into it, I found that it was a mechanism for a display for rocket engines and that also generated solar power. And that's the official explanation you'll find on the website for that museum. But their theory is that somehow these people built this black cube to worship Saturn. Another one that I thought was really funny was a black cube that they found outside the Apple computer store in New York City. Well, if you look up that location now, you'll see there's a transparent cube. Apparently, it had been covered in black for a while they were doing some kind of construction. and now it's clear. So I don't know if that was maybe the conspiracy was only temporary there. And the funniest one of all, in my mind, was one that was in Denmark, that was located in a city called, I don't want to try and pronounce it, but I'll spell it Svendborg. It so happened I had a friend in Denmark who knew about that, and he said, "Well, that thing's pretty much an embarrassment to us. It was just a sculpture that was built in 1983, and there was a lot of controversy whether it even ought to have been built at all." And one local, according to a magazine article, was supposed to have said it was the worst thing that happened to that city since the Nazis invaded.
So they're around in different things. So these cubes are all evidence that there's a secret group of Masonic or something. There's a Saturnine cult putting these cubes out to express Saturn's greatness or whatever.
Yeah, I mean, and that one, and the one there, for example, was just a geometric sculpture typical of the guy who put it together. And it's this type of thinking also leads me to wonder. They talk about how these black cubes were placed secretly as objects to worship Saturn. And I'm thinking, what is the purpose of doing this anyway? I mean, putting these black cubes out in the open like this, and if no one knows that they're altars to Saturn, what exactly is the point? It doesn't. It's seeing a black cube like that certainly doesn't persuade me that Saturn ought to be worshipped.
Right, it's just like a box, right?
Yeah, it's just a box. It's just sitting there. I mean, and one of these that was also in New York, you could actually physically turn it, and the artist had in mind that you could physically take hold of it and turn it. Sort of a fun thing to do. It's like I don't think, and when you think about the pagan gods like Saturn and their attitudes, I don't think they would be too happy with that.
Right, it doesn't quite fit. It's not too obvious.
No.
Yeah. So that's just one example, because people in my worldview also misinterpret the all-seeing eye. They always see anything in sinister. So even if they see the all-seeing eye in an old 16th or 17th century church, that has an occult, reference.
Yeah, exactly. And I'll make this point first. Who made the eye? You and I both agree that God made the eye. Okay, and so whose property? If the eye were copyrighted or registered, who would own it?
God.
Yeah, God would own it, exactly. So God has the ultimate control over this thing. So if some pagan religion claimed the all-seeing eye as its theme, would that mean that God would have to stop using it? Obviously not. No, not at all.
But there is like a perversion of, like, Crowley perverted the use of the all-seeing eye and superimposed the Eye of Horus in there. So that's what also confuses other people, is that there's different usages in different contexts. It's an intentionally blasphemous thing on Crowley. He was a blasphemer, but
he was very good. Yeah, he was good at inventing stuff like that. And one of the ironies is that even the Eye of Horus, as you mentioned, it wasn't an all-seeing eye. The story was that Horus had lost his eye in a battle with another deity, and it was restored to him later on with powers of health and protection. So it wasn't all-seeing. It was more like a protective talisman. So mixing all these different ideas together makes it, even less impressive when the conspiracy theorists come across and claim all the meaning that they put into it.
Right, but I mean, you talk about the obelisks, the measurements are off in Washington, but there's still a lot of like things in Washington. Like, I mean, you refute the whole notion of like a downward facing pentagram and a law influence plan, but there are obelisks in almost every major metropolitan area, right, in the world, right? I mean, there's obelisks all over the place that have been put up. Why have they been put up?
They have become, in the general answer to that, their initial use was, you might say, as notice boards. And the shape itself is supposed to be like frozen beam of sunlight pointing down. And the idea there being that we want to draw attention to what this is that we're showing you. We want you to come read whatever this is on the side, like a notice board. Now, from there, architecturally, they became something more general, which was like just sort of a marker. I mean, you say, yes, they're everywhere. I'm thinking now of a park right near me. My wife and I passed in the car on my way home to do this. If you go into the park and you go to a certain spot there, you'll see this very old, squat, about knee-high obelisk, and it's made of stone, and it's got some kind of number on it. Now, I don't know exactly what it was, but from the looks of it, it was some kind of property marker or some kind of surveying marker. And that's if you ask one of these conspiracy theorists, there's somebody who put that there to encourage us to worship some pagan deity. And yet, again, I walk into the park there, I see this thing with a number on it. I'm thinking, oh, that's it. I'm not going to think of any pagan deity when when that thing pops up or when I pass by it.
Right.
It's just some kind of marker. Yeah.
Yeah, but it's a marker, but that's also right there in the center of St. Peter's Square. I think that obelisk was brought to Rome by Caligula. Actually, was the one in the St. Peter's Square. So there's some interesting prior paganism in Rome, no doubt. But yeah, there's no obelisk in almost every major city.
Yeah. Yeah, and yes, you're correct. Caligula was the one who brought it in 37 AD. He claimed it from Egypt. And then one of the popes, Sixtus V, in 1586, he had it moved to Rome. And here's another theme that we can refer to here. Triumphant reclamation is what I call it. Just because some pagan has consecrated something like that doesn't mean it stays pagan. What many of the popes had in mind to do when they did things like this, and many early Christians as well, they would reclaim an object and redesignate its purpose for God. And let me give you an example from one of those other ideas of Christ supposedly being a pagan copycat figure. The worshippers of Mithra had this scene where Mithra was slaying the cosmic bull. As sort of a competition to that, and as sort of a game of one-upsmanship, the church redid that as a picture of Samson slaying a lion. And the idea was, well, these gods are false. Here's the real and genuine situation that you should have a look at instead. And for much the same reason, that's why they went ahead and claimed that obelisk. They redesignated it from being a pagan symbol to being a symbol of humanity reaching out to Christ. Now, you may say, well, that seems kind of a stretch. Maybe it is, but that's what their purpose was. They wanted to reclaim that for God, who, after all, did own it in the first place. He's the one who made the stones that were used to put the obelisk together. And so it was definitely a way to honor God rather than to encourage pagan worship.
Right, I've heard that rationale is pertaining to the obelisk, and that was Hernan Cortez. Every pyramid there got scraped off. Christian church, all of the people who were with him. So he reclaimed a lot of that stuff. Same thing happened in the States too, in America, where they had old ruins and things like that. So
exactly,
it doesn't mean that they're like maintaining these secret esoteric meanings or something like that. But I mean, that's the same thing with this whole pyramid. Have you ever heard the Great Pyramid thing? Like the cubes in the pyramid pertain to ages. This was actually a common kind of Christian thing one day, where like the pyramids laid out the plan of creation. Have you ever heard that old story?
I've heard a similar idea that from the 50s. One fellow used it to use the pyramids to decide when the end times would be, and he decided that they were going to be very soon. I forget his exact name. That's one thing I've run across. But yeah, I've seen the pyramids, and I believe was it the Jehovah's Witnesses who had ideas related to that, possibly?
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
There was like there's a late time preacher here in Los Angeles who did that, and he would scribble on the wall and tell everybody this, and then tell them to get on the phone and send money. Yeah, so those ideas around. These are ideas that are really populated a lot of Christianity. I mean, I spell it Christendom, like Christian, CHRISTENDUMB.
Yes, exactly.
It's kind of a form of Christendom, but it's not biblical. This whole great, the Great Pyramid stuff, and other things like this, like there's a lot of kind of anti-Catholic animus too. Like you go into Constantine and translations. Can you talk about that and how they're not really that conspiratorial?
Yeah, well, let's talk about Constantine. That is one of my favorite topics. I even made a video out of it. I said, is Constantine like Emperor Palpatine? Was he like Darth Vader's boss? Was he the evil emperor? And to sum it up, I looked into his life. I looked into the ideas he had. Constantine, I think, was a genuine Christian convert, but he wasn't particularly bright. I mean, he was a military grunt. He wasn't that interested in the fine details of theology. He wanted to arrange for peace, in the new empire that he he oversaw. And so he wanted to get things settled. And so he wasn't necessarily as attentive as he should have been towards theological niceties. But nevertheless, he tried what as best he could to change things. So, you look at some of these ideas that he had about. I remember one of the things that was cited was that apparently there were certain coins that were minted under his reign that still preserve certain mottos that were used under paganism. And they're like, well, why didn't he change those? He was still a pagan. Well, it's not that simple because the mints who made these coins often had their own authority to mint them. And not only that, it takes a long time. Even today, you can imagine how long it would take to change. You see how long it's been taking to change the dollar bills.
Right.
It's a long, complicated process. How much more complicated would it have been when the engraving tools were, much simpler time? And I don't know exactly what technology they used, but I'm sure it was some kind of like stamping or impression that they used. And so to mint new coins, they would have had to create a whole new infrastructure, so to speak, in the mint. And they're not going to do that overnight. In the meantime, people still need coins. And so they're going to continue to use the imprint that has the pagan motto on it until they can fix things up.
Right. So, I mean, and that's it. And then, like, they always apply it to Constantine that he was disingenuous, that he really genuinely didn't convert. He was using Christianity for his own nefarious plans and all kinds of stuff like that. So, a lot of things are written into kind of his life that may not be the case. And I mean, I think Christianity was rising there. So it's what, the 3rd century after Christ. So a lot more people were Christian at that time than at the very beginning of the faith. And also, there's a lot of translation things that people think that the Bible. You talk about, there's lost books, lost pieces, poor translations. Can you talk about that?
Oh my word! I could talk about that for 5 hours. I mean, there's so many. So it's ironic that you should mention this because one of my longtime readers wrote me a note just this morning asking me about this. He said, well, I have a friend who says she's reading this thing called the Book of Thoth. And she says that it tells you all kinds of great things about the Bible. And I'm like, okay, well, I've never heard this before. I know about Thoth being the Egyptian deity. But I look it up and I find like there's multiple books with going under Book of Thoth. And I wrote back to my friend. I said, well, can you ask which Book of Thoth she has in mind? Because there's hundreds of these things. He writes back to me this morning. He says, oh, it's the Emerald Book of Thoth. Oh, okay. So I looked that up, and it said the first thing I read in the description is Thoth was not the Egyptian god. He was an Atlantean priest who lived in 36,000 BC. I'm like, okay, I'm done.
It's like that fast.
Yeah, and yet this friend of mine's friend is saying, I believe this stuff, and it gives me great insight into the Bible. Where are you? Why are you picking this up? I mean, why would you even think this was a reliable source or that it was genuine? I don't know what kind of educational background this person had or what they were taught about critically thinking of sources, but one of the key problems we have right now is that people are not critical with sources. They believe anything that they've already decided they want to believe, and they don't investigate to any degree. And that's happening with Christian circles. That's happening in atheist circles. It's a universal problem.
Right. When people just pick up and they're mishmash. And I mean, I think it's like in an environment that we're in now with information overload, is that people aren't grading these things like why do we have the current corpus of these texts? Why are these all acceptable? Why aren't they? And I guess that problem really existed really when they started to compile all the works of the Bible, like what should go in and what shouldn't, right?
Yeah, well, sure. There were other candidate books that were considered, and some of them are pretty decent, like the Shepherd of Hermas. And they were written with some of them, like Shepherd of Hermas, were written with a good purpose. But ultimately, and not all the books that were suggested as candidates were necessarily corrupt or problematic. But ultimately, the purpose of a canon, I like to say, is another C word: convenience. You're putting together things that are true and relevant to what you're doing. And so in the biblical canon, you can see why something like the Gospel of Matthew would be in there, because if it has the truth about Jesus, you'd want it in there. And it's relevant because Matthew is a follower of Jesus and he has a lot of information about Jesus. On the other hand, your grocery list is true, but it's not relevant. You wouldn't you wouldn't put that in the canon because it's not relevant to Christianity at all. And related to this, of course, is that some books are of different genres, and so a book like Proverbs might belong in the canon. Well, with Proverbs, it's not necessarily a matter of things that are true or false, because Proverbs are by nature proverbs. They're just sort of just random sayings, you might say. So yeah, but there's other books like the Gospel of Thomas. I mean, there's like sort of like a target. They have some things in the center, and then as you go out in concentric circles, you have things that are less and less true or less and less relevant. Then you get books like the Gospel of Thomas that have Jesus sounding like a hippie of some kind,
Right.
from the 3rd century. So yeah, and one of the popular books for this as well is the Book of Jasher. Now that's another one I could talk about for a while.
Right.
Now,
So why is the Book of Jasher not in the canon?
well, now there's two things we should mention. First of all, there's a Book of Jasher mentioned in the Old Testament. That's not what people are talking about. The Book of Jasher they're talking about usually is a forgery that was done in the medieval era. That has nothing to do with the book that was written in the Old Testament times. Now, some people like to use that one because they use it to support some of Hislop's ideas. And it says in that Book of Jasher that 600,000 people took part in the construction of the Tower of Babel. That is found in that medieval forgery version of the Book of Jasher. And so that's why they use it. It's not because they've discovered that this is actually a reliable book by someone named Jasher in the Old Testament period. They use it because it has some piece of information in it that they find useful to support what they want to believe.
Right. And yeah, I mean, that's just going to be a recurrent problem all the way to the end of time, is people putting stuff in there. What's your Big GJ21 asks, what's your opinion of the Book of Enoch?
And I did some studies on that some years ago. If you talk, assuming we're not talking about another edition written later, but we're talking about the one from the 1st century thereabouts.
Right. Yeah.
I have the idea, based on how often it was added to and how often it was, how many people, both Jews and Christians, who made use of it, that it was sort of like a popular piece that was spread around as sort of like you might say, kind of like a fantasy novel would be today. And it was like sort of like one of those things. There's like a sort of a game like Mad Libs, where there used to be a thing on like online forums where people would add to a story. You'd write one paragraph, and then someone else would come along and sign in and add another paragraph, and you'd end up with something pretty hilarious a lot of the times. And I think Book of Enoch was in many ways like that. It gives us some insight into what certain people thought might have been true or might have made an interesting story, but there's no clear indication that anyone intended it to take it seriously as history. Although there may have been conspiracy theorists in that time and place who did.
There probably have been conspiracy theorists all the way through time, but I think that the Ethiopian church has included the Book of Enoch in their canon. Like their view is different. So
I believe you're right, and considering that they're a fair distance from where the events occurred, and both in time and space, I'd question the wisdom of that decision. But
right, and they have a huge church. I mean, that's pretty interesting differentiation. But yeah, we're at about, what is it? We're at 33 minutes. Is there anything else you'd like to add? I mean, we can go into the U.S., Illuminati, Catholics, political conspiracies. There's a lot of information in this book for sure.
Yeah. Oh, let me think now. Okay, the Illuminati. Now that's a pretty funny thing. Let me go ahead and dig those references out, because that was something I learned for the first time when I did research for this book. If you believe the conspiracy theorists, the Illuminati are still around right now, and they're causing all kinds of mischief. The actual history of the group, which was real, is that they began in the 1700s with a fellow named Adam Weishaupt. And it was more, I would describe it more as a social political kind of movement. He was like somewhat radical in some of his ideas, and he was trying to spread them around. But ultimately, what happened is that he got as a sort of an assistant a German baron who basically was trying to turn the movement into a party school. He was more into having fun meetings than he was into doing any radical change. But ultimately, this movement, if you want to call it a movement, I'll call it just a group of the Illuminati, came to an end in 1787. People got tired of them, and they basically suppressed them into non-existence by that time. But as one particular historian of conspiracy theory said, within 5 years, their whole industry emerged with over 50 books, which made up all kinds of wild claims about this group, doing all kinds of things, including being behind the French Revolution.
Right.
And for all I know, maybe there were swag stores back then, selling Illuminati T-shirts or I quit the Illuminati, keychains or whatever. I don't know.
Right.
So,
There's still like a variant out there today. There's still kind of a recruitment that tries to claim they're going back to the original Illuminati. But yeah, they weren't that influential over time. There was a rumor that they infiltrated the Masonic churches and influenced the French Revolution and things like that. But
it's all too easy to resort to such explanations. But I think, even though I was joking about the T-shirts and the keychains, I think there might be part of an explanation in there as well. But I think we can agree that paranoia can be a big seller, and so selling swag for things like this can make you a lot of money. I mean, Zeitgeist alone had millions upon millions of views on YouTube.
Yeah, tens of millions.
And I'm sure the fellow who created it earned a lot of money from that.
I think that he did a Zeitgeist 2 and 3, if I remember. I don't think I saw him, but I think that the Zeitgeist, what is it, series took place. I can't remember, but yeah, he was around for a while. I don't know what happened to him, but they definitely made an impact.
Yeah, yep.
And where's the best place for people to get this book, JP?
All right. Well, the best place to get it is on Amazon.com because it is a Kindle ebook. And so you want to go to Amazon and put in Jesus was a mushroom. And I'm sure it will be the first thing that come up, as I'm sure there are not too many books that have those two words in the title like that.
And your other books too, you have other books debunking, refuting certain things, Blood Moon, what's going on with slavery, Easter is pagan, and other fables. So there's a lot of things like those are all over the place. The whole Easter is a pagan thing. Christmas took over some other. This is another example of a date, but the Christian Christmas took over another holiday, pagan holiday, right?
Yeah, that's one of the big rumors now. Yeah, you're right. I have a whole book on that too. But to the extent that may be true, that could be seen as a form of, again, triumphant reclamation. Like
right.
The analogy I use is if JCPenney has a sale on October 3rd, then you can bet that Kmart's going to have a sale the same day to make sure that their own shoppers are kept occupied. It's up in the air whether Jesus was born on December 25th. Unfortunately, people of that time, unless they were very wealthy, had no way to keep track of the calendar and no idea. Many people could not tell you, even in many cultures today, could not tell you the exact date they were born. And so it didn't really matter what date they picked. So December 25th has a 1 in 365 chance of being right. So
there you go. Those are decent odds. We Steal Plato Snakes asks, what are your thoughts on Zeitgeist upon Jordan Maxwell? Are you familiar with him and his teachings?
I've only heard of Jordan Maxwell a couple of times. I did not look into his material. I just didn't have time to look into that. I have too many other things that I was looking into.
I think he was a Blavatsky, what is it, Theosophist or something like that.
Yeah. That's a little. I looked into Theosophy when I was like 16 or 17. It didn't take me long to decide it wasn't worth my effort.
Yeah, she's been debunked. She had some interesting ideas, but love of Prometheus, which you can figure out who that symbolizes. I mean, that's a whole nother story. But yeah, you actually talk about Spangler, Maitreya, Benjamin Cream, and some of these other characters around. I mean, do you want to wrap up talking about them or your thoughts about them?
I'll talk about Benjamin Cream because there's some very interesting history there. When I was a Christian very early on, there was a book that was put out called "Hidden Dangers of the Rainbow" by Constance Cumby.
Yeah,
yeah. Have you ever read that book?
No, I have not.
If you read it now, it's so interesting to go back and read some of these books of the time, like Hidden Dangers of the Rainbow. Another one that I really enjoyed reading again from that time was Phil Phillips' Turmoil in the Toy Box. And that had all kinds of ideas that toys being given to people were given to their kids were like teaching them to worship Satan. There was an example that I can't resist giving one example, even though it's not related to this book. He made a big deal of the fact that He-Man said things like, "By the power of Grayskull," and Phillips made this solemn pronouncement that the Bible does not mention the power of Grayskull. Well, okay, that's I wouldn't expect it to. I mean, okay,
Right.
but as far as Benjamin Cream, I'm mentioning Cumby because Benjamin Cream was a concern when Cumby wrote her book, and she made a big deal about him. And what happened is that on April 25th, 82, his organization took out some full-page ads in newspapers declaring the Christ is now here, and that he would soon send out a telepathic address to the world. Now, of course, Cumby and many like her assumed that this was the Antichrist who was going to come out of the nowhere, and that Cream would be like his disciple, so to speak. Well, 27 years later, when I wrote that book, and I haven't checked up on him lately, but maybe I should, Cream is still plugging this telepathic address and saying, "It's coming soon, it's coming soon." And I'm like, well, where is it then? I mean, who is still following this guy? Actually, not really anybody. I found there was a meeting that he spoke to in Detroit, which attracted maybe 800 people. And that's from a metro area at the time that had 4 million people. So I don't think Benjamin Cream is really that much of a threat. But Cumby and others like her acted like this was a very serious problem. And you mentioned David Spangler, the same thing. I mean, you look into these people, they really don't have that much of a following. No one really pays that much attention to them. It's like, I guess you could call them Antichrist wannabes, if anything else. But I would be looking.
Yeah, pay them so much, give them so much credence. Yeah, interesting. Yeah. And anything you'd like to add, or anything I missed before we wrap this up, JP?
Well, I don't have anything in particular to add at this point, but I do appreciate having been on again. It's been a pleasure to be with you and to talk about these subjects. One of the things that's very close to me as a subject of concern is making sure that people get good information. And there are so many corrupt and so many poor sources of information out there. There's a will to believe things all too readily and all too easily. One of the great contributors to this, I believe, is, I call it the abomination that causes misinformation, Wikipedia. There's nothing so horrendous to me as a librarian by trade as a reference source that anyone can pick up and scribble into it whatever they want.
Right. So people got to be wary. People are credulous, and a lot of people are just looking around to get their ears tickled. So they have to kind of watch out. And again, there's a lot more information in this book. We barely covered all the stuff. You really went in detail on a lot of other topics and issues. Again, the title of the book is "Jesus Was a Mushroom and Other Lies You Won't Believe," and the author again is J.P. Holding. And I'll put a link to the book and his website in the show notes. So JP, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much for having me. Take care.
All right, take care. You too. Stay there. Stay there.